There's a particular kind of resistance that shows up right before something in you shifts. It doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like hesitation dressed up as logic. You're about to do the thing you've been thinking about for weeks. Send the email, make the call, end the loop, stop explaining yourself, start the new routine, and suddenly your mind becomes a professional attorney for the old life. It produces arguments with impressive speed. Not now. Wait until you're more stable. You don't have enough information. You might regret it. You should think about it more. And the weird part is, this doubt often gets louder right at the edge of change, almost as if your nervous system can sense you're about to cross a line. It can't uncross, so it throws up one last wall of noise to keep you in familiar territory. This is how the ego tries to preserve the old structure, not by screaming at you in obvious fear, but by making you delay. Procrastination spikes when something feels irreversible. You don't scroll because you're lazy. You scroll because your system is stalling for time. You clean a drawer. You check a notification that doesn't matter. You start researching the perfect way to proceed, and the research becomes a loop that feels productive, but keeps you safely in place. Resistance peaks right before expansion, because expansion requires a loss of control. The old structure, the identity you've been operating from, the coping strategies you've relied on, the internal rules you've used to stay safe, can feel itself losing authority. So it tightens, it argues, it negotiates, it tries to make the threshold feel dangerous enough that you back away. If you've felt that tension lately, it's worth noticing how physical it can be. It shows up in your shoulders, your jaw, your stomach. The same thought repeats with a slight edge of urgency. It's not just mental, it's your body bracing. And that's the part that makes it confusing. You think, if this were right, shouldn't it feel easier? Shouldn't I feel excited? Shouldn't I feel confident? But a structural shift rarely begins with fireworks. Often, it begins with friction because you're trying to move forward while a part of you is still gripping the old railings. That gripping gets exhausting, and eventually, something else happens that people don't always name correctly. You hit a kind of emotional exhaustion that isn't just tiredness, it's the end of forcing. You realize you can't try harder anymore. Not because you lack discipline, but because the strategies that used to work have stopped working. You can push yourself into motion. You can hold it together for a day or a week. You can perform competence. You can pretend you're fine, and then you hit the same wall again. The same emptiness, the same drop in meaning, the same quiet sense that you're burning fuel for a destination that no longer exists. This is where people often confuse burnout with failure. They think the exhaustion means they're weak, that they lost their edge, that they're falling behind. But sometimes the exhaustion is simply the moment the old engine runs out of what it used to run on. The old engine was fueled by pressure, by urgency, by self-criticism, by needing to prove you're okay. It pushed you forward because stopping felt unsafe. When that engine begins to sputter, you lose not only momentum, but the familiar sensation of being propelled. And the absence of propulsion can feel like sliding backward when you're actually just no longer being whipped forward by fear disguised as motivation. There's relief hidden beneath this, even if you don't want to admit it. The relief is not happiness. It's not optimism. It's the release of a pressure you didn't realize you were maintaining every day. Because you've been carrying an agreement you never consciously signed. The agreement to keep forcing life to fit, to keep enduring what doesn't fit, to keep managing yourself so everything stays predictable, to keep proving you can handle it. When force stops working, the agreement starts dissolving. And that can feel like collapse from the outside, but inside, it can feel like a strange kind of honesty. You're no longer able to fake your way through your own dissatisfaction. You can't talk yourself into the old cycle with the same convincing tone. You can't make yourself care the way you used to. That's not you falling apart. That's you becoming unable to live a life that requires self-betrayal to maintain. One of the clearest signs you're in this phase is that old patterns stop restarting, habits lose emotional charge, conflicts that used to feel mandatory begin to feel optional. The same trigger shows up and it doesn't hook you the way it used to, or it hooks you for a moment and then slips away without starting a war inside your chest. This can be unsettling because struggle has a way of making you feel alive. Anxiety doesn't feel good, but it feels familiar. Overthinking doesn't feel peaceful, but it feels like you're doing something. Reactivity gives shape to the day, so when the reactivity fades, the mind can interpret it as numbness or emptiness. But there's a kind of calm that isn't numbness. It's the calm that comes after a long internal fight stops, not because you won, but because the fight no longer makes sense. You can feel this when repetition breaks. You try to restart an old loop, checking, chasing, explaining, fixing, rehearsing, and it just doesn't give you the same payoff. It feels flat. Your nervous system isn't buying it anymore. You may even notice that returning to the old version of you feels harder now. You can still do it if you have to. You can still wear the mask, still perform the role, still say the right lines, but it costs too much. Your body knows. The moment you step back into the old posture, something tightens. Something gets tired immediately. That's the quiet truth. When repetition breaks, evolution accelerates because you no longer have the same access to your old sedation. This is where people often look for motivation and can't find it. They expect a breakthrough to feel like a surge. They expect excitement, certainty, direction, but you may feel disoriented instead. And disorientation is not a sign that the process is failing. It's often the doorway has loosened, but the new one has loosened, but the new one hasn't become legible yet. You can't fully return to who you were, but you can't describe who you're becoming. Your mind loses its map before your life provides a new one. And because the mind hates ambiguity, it treats this phase like danger. It wants labels, it wants a plan, it wants something measurable that proves you're not wasting time. You can feel that urgency in the way you keep asking yourself what you should be doing, what your purpose is, what the next step is, why you don't feel more certain if you're truly changing. But the truth is, losing certainty often comes before gaining direction. The old meanings expire before the new ones can be lived. That gap feels chaotic because you're no longer being carried by habit. You're no longer being distracted from the deeper questions. You're not being propelled by the same internal noise. And without that noise, you're forced to face the fact that you've outgrown certain ways of being. The quiet internal decision forms underneath confusion, not as a dramatic announcement, but as a series of refusals. You become less available for what drains you. You tolerate less without making speeches about it. You stop negotiating with patterns that require you to shrink. That's not stagnation. That's identity reorganizing itself in private. If you've noticed yourself pulling back in subtle ways, that's part of the shift. Your standards quietly rise before external results show up. People like to talk about standards as if they're a motivational slogan. Raise your standards. Demand more. Don't settle. But real standards often rise in a quieter way. They rise as a limit. You simply can't tolerate the same thing without feeling the cost. A conversation that used to be fine now feels draining. A dynamic you used to accept now feels like static. A habit you used to call self-care now feels like avoidance. You might still do some of these things out of habit, but now you feel the friction. You can't pretend it's neutral anymore. This is self-respect arriving before applause. It's you being willing to lose comfort without having proof that something better is coming. It's your internal expectations changing before your circumstances can validate them. And this is where the breakthrough actually begins, even if it doesn't look like progress yet. The breakthrough starts the moment your standards change, because once your standards shift, you can't unknow what you know. The old life begins losing authority over you, not because you're forcing a reinvention, but because you're no longer willing to pay the same emotional price. The mind often tries to interpret this as isolation or emptiness, especially if you're used to constant stimulation. If you've been living with constant internal noise, constant checking, constant problem solving, constant social scanning, then stillness can feel like a void. You may notice yourself craving distraction in the quiet moments, not because you're bored, but because silence makes you feel exposed. It removes the background soundtrack that told you who you were. It stops you from rehearsing. It stops you from managing. And in that stillness, you can feel the rawness of not knowing. This is why there's often silence before momentum. The deeper system clears first. It loosens attachments. It quiets old responses. It stabilizes your nervous system before it accelerates. The mind wants momentum first. It wants the excitement, the certainty, the visible change. But the nervous system doesn't work that way. After long periods of stress, the body needs to learn a new baseline. It needs to learn that safety doesn't require constant bracing. It needs to experience calm without interpreting it as danger. And that takes time. It takes quiet. It takes repetition of small moments where you don't react the way you used to, where you don't interfere, where you don't panic your way back into familiar loops. This pullback can feel like life is slowing down, like nothing is happening, like you're waiting. But psychologically, it's often preparation. Reflection strengthens direction, not reflection as endless analysis, but reflection as integration, letting experiences settle, letting the nervous system stop firing, letting your internal standards become stable rather than reactive. You can think of it like the pause before an actual physical jump. There's a dip, a gathering, a moment where you seem to be going down before you go up. If you don't understand that, you can misread it as failure. But if you've ever watched someone prepare to leap, you know the pause isn't weakness, it's mechanics. The pause is preparation, not stagnation. And because it's quiet, doubt shows up again. Doubt loves quiet seasons. Doubt loves anything that can't be measured yet. It tries to convince you that because there's no external proof, you're making it up. It tells you you're behind. It tells you you've wasted time. It tells you that other people are moving and you're stuck. It tells you that if you were truly changing, you would feel more motivated. It tells you that if you were truly close to something, you would feel more confident. But the closer you get to a real shift, the more the old structure tries to reassert itself. Doubt increases right before proof because proof would make the old identity obsolete. This is where the temptation to quit becomes strong. Not dramatic quitting, just subtle quitting. You go back to the old habits because they're familiar. You return to the old circles because they provide immediate feedback. You restart the old arguments because intensity feels like aliveness. You overwork because busyness makes you feel in control. You overthink because overthinking makes you feel like you're doing something. The old structure offers comfort at the cost of truth, and in the in-between phase, that trade can be seductive. But if you're here, if this is landing, it's probably because you're already noticing the difference between hype and recognition. Hype inflates you for 10 minutes, and then you crash. Recognition steadies you. It doesn't give you a false high. It gives you a quiet clarity that feels personal, not because someone on a screen knows you, but because you're at the psychological stage where the words can finally land. There are certain messages you can hear for years, and they bounce off, not because you're incapable, but because you weren't ready to live from them. Then one day, the same idea arrives, and it doesn't feel like advice. It feels like something inside you nodding, almost annoyed, like, yes, we know. We've been knowing. You're just finally admitting it. That timing can feel precise, almost intimate, and it's not superstition, it's readiness. Your identity has shifted enough that what used to be theory becomes real. That's why this moment can feel like confirmation without being hype. Not a promise that everything is about to explode into perfection, but a recognition that the internal shift is already happening. You're not at the beginning of the process. You're in the middle of it. You're in the part where the old structure is losing control, and that's why it feels harder. Here's a paradox worth holding on to just once, because it tends to be true. The moment you're closest to changing is often the moment you feel least certain about it. Certainty is something the old identity loves because certainty makes performance easier. But real change doesn't always come with certainty. Sometimes it comes with coherence, a sense in your body that something is right, even if you can't justify it perfectly yet. So what do you do when resistance peaks, when motivation is low, when you feel disoriented, when the old patterns won't restart the way they used to, and the new life hasn't become visible yet? You don't need a dramatic ritual. You don't need to force a personality makeover. You need a way to stay with the shift without interfering with it. A gentle micro-practice can help here, not because it solves everything, but because it stabilizes you at the edge of change. The next time you feel that familiar surge of doubt, especially when you're about to do something aligned, something that would quietly end an old loop, you might try pausing long enough to notice what part of you is speaking. Put a hand somewhere you can feel your body, take 2 slow breaths, and ask yourself a question that doesn't demand a perfect answer. What is the old structure trying to protect right now? You might notice it's protecting familiarity, it's protecting a role, it's protecting the identity of being the one who can handle it. Then ask, just as quietly, what would I do if I didn't need to preserve that role for one more day? That second question is not a command. It's a window. Sometimes all you need is a window. And then you choose the smallest possible action that aligns with your new standard, not a grand leap, the smallest clean step. Maybe it's not sending the reactive message. Maybe it's not explaining yourself to someone who refuses to hear you. Maybe it's closing the tab, going for a short walk, letting your nervous system settle, and not forcing a decision tonight. Maybe it's saying no without an essay attached. Maybe it's choosing rest, without treating it like a weakness. These small actions are how self-trust is built in the quiet phase. They are also how momentum begins, because momentum that lasts is not built on pressure. It's built on a new baseline. And this is the last piece that matters. You're probably closer than you think. Not because the universe owes you a reward, not because everything is about to magically align, but because the pattern you're describing, the spike in doubt, the end of forcing, the inability to restart old loops, the disorientation, the rising standards, the quiet before momentum, these are the mechanics of a structural shift. It feels harder because the old structure is losing control. It feels confusing because the new structure isn't fully formed yet. It feels quiet because your nervous system is stabilizing. It feels like nothing is happening because the progress is internal first. The temptation is to quit too early, to go back to comfort, because comfort can be measured. But the internal shift already happening is not asking you for a dramatic transformation. It's asking you to move differently, to respond from the new standard rather than the old fear, to stop interfering with the process by trying to force certainty, force motivation, force proof. If you've been feeling resistance lately, if you've been feeling exhausted in a way that trying harder doesn't fix, if you've noticed old patterns losing their grip, if you've felt disoriented rather than inspired, if you've sensed your standards quietly rising, if you've been in a quiet pause that feels like stagnation but doesn't quite fit that label, then it makes sense that this is landing now. Not as hype, not as a warning, but as a kind of confirmation that you're at the edge of a shift and your system knows it. You're seeing this just before your breakthrough because you're finally ready to move differently, and the proof you're waiting for usually arrives after you stop trying to force it.